She had a name, she had a life. A front door she locked every morning and a seat at a table that someone still can't bring themselves to move. There were people who loved her. People who knew the sound of her footsteps, the particular way she held her coffee cup, the exact pitch of her laugh. She was woven into the ordinary fabric of other people's days. And then, without warning, without explanation, that thread was simply gone, not in the way we prepare for. Not with a phone call, not with a goodbye, not with the kind of ending that, however painful, at least gives you something to hold. She was there one day and not the next. And in the space between those two moments, in that quiet, unremarkable gap, something happened, something that no one has been able to fully explain. Something that, according to those who have followed this case most closely, may be far more complicated than anyone first understood. Nancy Guthrie was not a headline at first. She was a person. A woman with habits and routines, and a particular way of moving through her days. The kind of person you pass in a parking lot without a second thought, because nothing about her existence announced itself as extraordinary. Until one day, everything changed. Until the people who loved her most were standing in front of cameras, holding photographs with shaking hands, asking strangers to help them find someone who should have been home. What really happened to her? Not the version that fits neatly into a summary, not the cleaned-up official account, but the truth that lives in the hours, the decisions, the silences. The parts of a story that don't make it into reports. Investigators have raised questions. Experts have examined the available evidence and found gaps that don't resolve easily. And somewhere at the intersection of all of it, a theory has emerged. One that, according to those who have studied this case with genuine depth, may change the way we understand everything that came before it. Stay with this. Because what follows is not what most people expected. There are places in this world that hold a specific kind of quiet. Small towns where generations of the same families have grown up beside each other, where people still wave from their driveways and know the names of each other's children and pets. Where a new face is noticed and an absent one is felt. Nancy Guthrie lived in a place like that. It mattered, because it meant that when she was gone, people noticed immediately. There was no ambiguity, no wondering whether she'd just moved on without saying so. The people around her knew she was missing because they knew her. Really knew her, the way you only know someone after years of small, shared moments. By all available accounts, she was a woman who had built something real. Not a life that called attention to itself, not one built for display. Just a life with actual weight to it, relationships she had tended carefully, a home that reflected who she was, a daily rhythm that the people around her could depend on. Those who spent time with her described someone who was genuinely present. The kind of person who remembered the things you mentioned in passing, who showed up when it mattered, who, when she asked how you were doing, actually paused to hear the answer. That quality, that kind of attentiveness, is rarer than people realize, and it made her absence louder. She was not someone who disappeared. The people closest to her say this not as a defense of her character, but as a plain statement of fact. It simply wasn't something she did. And so when she wasn't where she was supposed to be, no one waited. No one told themselves there was probably a reasonable explanation. They knew. The particular cellular way you know when something is wrong with someone you truly love. They called, they drove, they knocked on doors, and what they found, or rather what they didn't find, set in motion a chain of events that would take months to even begin to unravel. The days that followed were the kind that change a family in ways that don't fully heal. Phone calls that rang into silence, a door that stayed closed no matter how many times someone knocked, the specific, suffocating stillness of a space that should have had someone in it. Questions multiplying faster than anyone could track them, and answers that refused to come. And then, eventually, the investigators arrived. The reports began, the interviews started. The slow, heavy machinery of an official search ground into motion, trying to reconstruct something that may have been partially hidden long before anyone thought to look. What no one understood at the time, what only becomes clear when you look back from a distance, is that the story of what happened to Nancy Guthrie had already been building, quietly. In the details no one thought to question, in the version of events that seemed, on its surface, entirely unremarkable, that surface held for a while. And then, piece by careful piece, it began to give way. To understand what changed, you first have to sit with what came before. Because what came before, by every available account, was a life that had found its footing. Nancy had navigated difficult stretches, the kind most people move through at some point, the ordinary grief of transitions and adjustments and starting over. But those who were around her in the months before she vanished described someone who seemed to have come out the other side of something, more grounded, more settled. Like a person who had finally arrived somewhere after a long journey they hadn't fully named. She had plans. Not grand ones, but specific and real, the kind of plans that belong to someone who fully expects to be around to carry them out. A trip she'd brought up more than once in conversation. Something she was working on at home that she seemed genuinely excited about. Those small, forward-looking details matter. They paint a picture of someone oriented toward the future, not retreating from it. Her neighbors saw her in her usual rhythms. Her patterns were consistent. From the outside, nothing would have flagged as wrong. But investigators who study disappearances speak often about what they call the quiet period. That stretch of time just before someone vanishes when everything visible looks completely normal. When the person is functional, even cheerful, present in all the ways that count. When the people around them have absolutely no reason to think something is coming. And according to those who have reviewed Nancy's timeline, her final days matched that description almost exactly. She was seen, she was heard, she was by every measure anyone could observe there, and then she wasn't. The question that would take investigators months to even begin framing properly wasn't just where she went. It was what the quiet period had been quietly hiding. The first days of a missing persons search carry their own particular energy. There's movement everywhere, interviews, canvases, the urgent gathering of every detail anyone can offer. People want to help, they cooperate. There is fear, yes, but there is also something that feels productive, like the machinery of resolution is already in motion. What most people don't realize is that it's often in these early, frantic hours that the first real cracks appear. Not in dramatic moments, not with flashing lights, but in the small places, the account that doesn't quite line up with another account, the gap in a timeline that nobody can explain. The detail so minor-seeming that it almost gets passed over entirely. According to reports from those familiar with the early stages of the investigation, it was exactly that kind of detail that first gave the investigators reason to slow down. There was an account of Nancy's whereabouts on a particular day that, when examined carefully, didn't fully align with what other information was suggesting. Not obviously. Not in a way that a casual observer would have caught, but enough. Enough that a question got raised, and once raised, it could not be filed away and forgotten. What had she actually been doing in those final hours? Who had she been with? And among all the people being interviewed, who genuinely knew the answers, and who was unknowingly working from incomplete information. The more questions investigators asked, the more a certain picture emerged. There were people in Nancy's life who believed they knew her well, and who, in many ways, did. But there were also others, quieter, less visible, operating at the edges of her world, who may have known things that the more obvious figures in her life simply didn't. According to available reports, the circle of inquiry began to widen. New interviews were requested. The investigation started reaching into spaces it hadn't thought to examine at the start. And what came back was not a cleaner picture. It was a more complicated one, the shape of something that didn't resolve the way anyone had hoped. The people who loved her were watching all of this from the outside, waiting, trying to read the movement as progress. Trying to believe that all those questions being asked were leading somewhere real. They were leading somewhere, but not toward the answers anyone had imagined. Evidence accumulates in its own rhythm. It doesn't announce itself. It builds the way pressure builds, slowly, across days and weeks that blur together, each individual piece too small to carry much weight on its own. But collectively, over time, the pieces stop being ignorable. There comes a moment when the weight of them together demands a response. For investigators working Nancy's disappearance, that moment arrived without ceremony, not in a dramatic reveal, but in the middle of an ordinary review. When something filed away connected to something else, and a pattern became visible for the first time. According to sources familiar with the inquiry, what emerged was exactly that, a pattern. Not a single smoking piece of evidence, but a constellation of movements, communications, and decisions from the period just before Nancy disappeared that told a different story than the one that had been offered. There were communications that had not been fully accounted for, movements that didn't match what people had described. And there were, according to reports, financial dimensions to the picture that hadn't surfaced in the early stages at all, threads that, when pulled, led somewhere unexpected. It's important to be clear about what this means and what it doesn't. No official determination has been reached about what ultimately happened to Nancy Guthrie. Investigators have been careful, and necessarily so, about what they've stated publicly. The evidence that exists is still being evaluated. The full picture, whatever it eventually turns out to be, has not yet been drawn. But what the emerging pattern told the investigation was something significant. The version of Nancy's life that had been presented in those first urgent days had gaps in it, meaningful ones. There were dimensions of her circumstances, pressures, connections, realities that had not been fully disclosed. And the question of who knew about those dimensions, and when they knew, was becoming the center of everything. Sometimes in a case like this, there is a single moment that shifts the whole frame. It doesn't have to be explosive. It doesn't have to be obvious. It can arrive quietly, buried in a document, or surfacing in the middle of an interview that seemed like it was going nowhere, or emerging from the comparison of two pieces of information that had never been placed side by side before. Investigators wait for these moments. They work toward them slowly, knowing they can't be forced. And according to those who have followed this case most closely, a moment like that did arrive. The specific details of what emerged haven't been made fully public. That's the nature of active investigations. Certain things are held deliberately, either to protect the integrity of ongoing work or because their significance is still being carefully assessed. But what has been reported, and what experts who have reviewed the available information have suggested, is that the nature of Nancy's relationships, particular ones, specific ones that hadn't been part of the early conversation, were at the center of the shift. There are always people in a life who exist in the foreground, the ones in the photographs, the ones whose names get mentioned first. And then there are the others, quieter, further from view, connected in ways that aren't obvious unless you know to look. According to reports, it was in that quieter space that investigators found something that changed the trajectory of the case. The families of missing persons often describe this phase as one of the most disorienting, because it's the phase where the person you've been searching for starts to reveal dimensions you didn't know existed, where the world they were living in turns out to have had rooms you didn't know about. Grief, already enormous, gets complicated by something harder to name, a kind of renegotiation of everything you thought you understood. The people who loved Nancy were entering that. And they were entering it without a map, the way everyone does. There are investigators who work specifically in the space between official conclusions and unanswered questions. People who bring a methodical, patient kind of attention to cases that haven't resolved cleanly, who read patterns in the gaps, who follow threads that others have let go of. And it is in this kind of sustained, careful scrutiny, according to reports, that the theory around Nancy's case was eventually assembled. It is not a theory built on imagination or speculation. It is built from the accumulated weight of what didn't add up, the timelines that didn't align, the movements that couldn't be accounted for, the connections that were invisible until they weren't. And what it suggests, when you lay all of it out together, is a picture of Nancy's final days that is more layered, and in some ways more difficult to sit with, than what most people had been working from. The theory centers on circumstances that, according to those who have studied it, may have placed Nancy in a position of real vulnerability, not in a careless sense of that word, but in a specific, structural sense. A set of pressures converging, a situation in which her options may have been narrower than anyone around her realized, or perhaps narrower than she let on. Whether those pressures originated entirely outside of her, or whether some of them were the result of her own navigation of something she was managing privately, remains genuinely open. Experts who have commented on the available evidence are careful here, not to avoid the question, but because the evidence as it currently stands doesn't answer it definitively. What the theory does do, however, is change the lens. The details of her final weeks, read through this framework, look different. Communications that seemed unremarkable take on new weight. Absences that seemed ordinary become harder to explain away. And the people at the edges of the picture step a little closer to the center. At the heart of all of it, unchanged and unanswered, is still the same question the people who loved her have been living with since the beginning. Where is Nancy Guthrie? No official conclusion has been reached. No definitive answer has been given. According to available reports, the investigation remains active. And the people who knew her, who loved her, have not stopped asking, have not decided that not knowing is something they can accept. That refusal, that continued insistence on the question, may yet be the thing that finally breaks it open. Cases like this one have a way of staying. Not at the front of your mind necessarily, but somewhere, at the edge of your awareness, in the quiet moments before sleep. In the way certain news headlines land, differently once you've sat with a story like this one. The unresolved ones leave a particular residue. They remind you that the world contains more uncertainty than we generally let ourselves think about. Nancy Guthrie is still a missing person. As of this writing, no confirmed account exists of what happened to her. No one has been officially held responsible, and no definitive answer has been given to the people who need one most. The investigation remains open. The questions are real. That is not a small thing to sit with. What the picture that has emerged, incomplete as it is, speaks to is something larger than this one case. It speaks to how thoroughly we can love someone and still not know the full weight of what they were carrying. How wide the space can be between what a person shows the world and what is actually true for them. How the story of a life, even a life you thought you knew, can have entire chapters that never made it into the version you were given. It also speaks to how investigations actually work. Not the way they do in a scripted hour of television, where threads resolve and answers arrive on cue, but slowly, across months. Through the painstaking accumulation of small details that individually mean almost nothing and together begin to mean everything. Through the willingness of people, investigators, family members, the people who simply refuse to stop paying attention, to keep asking even when the asking is exhausting. For the people who loved Nancy, who are still loving her, still waiting, still holding the specific shape of her in their minds, this is not a story. It is not a theory or a case number or an open file. It is a person, her voice, the exact way she moved through a room, the chair that still doesn't feel right with someone else in it. That is what the language of investigation so often fails to hold, the irreducible fact of a specific human life. Someone's daughter, someone's oldest friend. Someone who had plans and a future, and a particular way of being in the world that is not replaceable. The theory that has surfaced, the one that experts suggest may reframe the understanding of this case, is not a conclusion. It is a direction. A new angle on something that has already been examined many times from many directions. Sometimes that is what it takes. Not a sudden revelation, but a slow shift in perspective. A willingness to look again at what was already there. To ask the question one more time from a slightly different place and see what comes back. Nancy Guthrie deserves an answer. The people who love her deserve an answer. And for the ones who are still asking, still refusing to let her name fade into the background of forgotten cases, that refusal is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the most important things a person can do for someone who is no longer here to ask for themselves. If this story settled somewhere in you, if it stayed, that's exactly what it was meant to do. Cases like this live in the details, in the small things that are easy to overlook right up until they become impossible to ignore. If you have thoughts, questions, something this brought up for you, leave it below. Those conversations matter more than you might think. And if you want to stay close to stories told this way, carefully, slowly, with the weight they deserve, consider subscribing. There is more. And every story, until it finally finds its answer, is worth staying with.